Iceberg videos are something I've done quite a few times, and The Good Place is a show that I've really enjoyed but never got around to talking about despite wanting to for many Jeremy Bearamys now. And I'm honestly not sure how. The show is full of references, theories, and little tiny details that even the most eagle-eyed viewer might have missed. I certainly missed a good bit of these on my first watch through. So what better way to go through the series and some of these bits than by continuing our Iceberg trend we've been on. And since I've done quite a few Iceberg videos on the channel by this point, I figure I can probably keep the description of what exactly an Iceberg video is fairly brief. I'm going to go through each point from top to bottom and discuss each of them. The top are more well-known theories or facts, and as you go further down into the dark unknown, things can get a bit darker and sometimes more abstract. And because this show can be pretty dense with philosophical meaning, I decided to bring in an Iceberg expert to help me out with a couple points.
Hey guys, Extended here. If you don't know me, I make all kinds of videos, but some of my favorites are icebergs. I just want to give a big thanks to 10K for having me on. I really can't express how appreciative I am for it. That being said, if you enjoy me in this video, feel free to check out my channel. But with that out of the way, let's get back to the video.
And really quickly, consider this your spoiler warning for all things The Good Place. This video isn't going to be shying away from huge spoilers or anything, and many of them are kind of necessary to talk about. And hey, while we're here, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. It definitely helps the algorithm not hate my channel. Michael based his neighborhood on Eagleton from Parks and Rec. The Schurverse, as it's affectionately known, is the idea that The Office, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and Parks and Rec are all within the Good Place universe. Mulverine did a video on that a while back if you want some more details into some of that stuff, but for this point specifically, just know that's kind of the basics of it. So if these places all exist in the same universe and could possibly be different towns where similar things are happening, could it be that Michael based his town off of Eagleton, the much nicer but eventually bankrupt town in the Parks and Rec universe? The main part of the theory basically just comes down to the fact that Reston St. James, the Eagleton architect, kind of looks like Michael. Like, if you squint, you know? And if we stop to think about it, even if Pawnee and The Office aren't going through a similar thing to what's going on in The Good Place, if it still exists within the universe, Eagleton would likely be on the demon's radar. I mean, almost every character we've seen from Eagleton is generally a pretty terrible person, right? I mean, the town is made up almost exclusively of rich, powerful snobs. Seems like something that demons would absolutely love and would probably keep an eye on in some way, shape, or form. May 10th, 2003. May 10th, 2003, a date that probably means, well, not a lot to a lot of people, but this date is actually called out very specifically in the season 2 premiere of the show, and the date is specifically called out for Chidi, but why is never actually expanded on. But there is one theory that sort of delves into it. Unintended consequences is a huge part of what makes up the original point system. Basically, it just kind of boils down to the idea that no matter what you do, you're actively losing points because at some point down the chain of a product being created and distributed, something not so great is happening. Consumerism's fun. It doesn't matter if it's something like iPhones being made in sweatshops or something like almond milk. In this case, we're going to be talking about almond milk. Almond milk, you see, despite being probably a bit healthier for you, a person, is certainly not healthier for the environment. But even if he knew all of that, Chidi really enjoyed drinking almond milk. And he kind of jokes throughout the series that's probably a major reason why he actually got sent to the bad place. And this theory says that yes, that's probably true. And the gaps that Chidi has in his life on May 10th, 2003 are actually when Chidi first tries almond milk. The day that would, quite possibly, seal his fate. Trevor flying through the void. Adam Scott is a very familiar face for fans of Parks and Rec. In that show, he plays the main character of Ben Wyatt, but in The Good Place, he plays an immortal torturer known as Trevor. He is eventually flung into the void. And while this would kill just about anyone, Trevor is actually an immortal being. He doesn't need to eat, he doesn't need to breathe, he'll always exist. So despite being thrown out into the harshness of the void,
you get one more.
We do actually see Trevor again in the series. actually a few times in the series. You see, just about any time we see different dimensions or anything of a black void, if you look carefully, you can actually see and hear Trevor flying by and screaming, like here in Season 3, Episode 11. Damned to fly, lost in the void forever. His own personal bad place.
The Swanson Safe. The show's creator is very well known for some of his other high-performing series, one of which includes Parks and Rec. One of the most iconic characters in the show is named Ron Swanson. Ron is known to have switched careers several times in the show, but there was no real evidence to point the finger at Swanson for being the safe manufacturer seen in The Good Place. This was until the Swanson Safe ad was released to the Good Place podcast. After hearing the ad, I think it's fair to say that Ron was the indirect cause for Jason's death.
Dot above the eye represents the void. Time is a constant, except when it's not. Like specifically the weird nature of time and how time flows in the afterlife. While on Earth and in the rest of the universe, time moves in a relatively linear fashion, but in the afterlife, time kind of curves a bit more. While time does pass in some way, the flowing of time more directly resembles, when written out, the words Jeremy bear me in English cursive. But there is one specific part that isn't connected at all, and that's even something that's brought up by Chidi. The dot above the eye, also known as a tittle. That fact isn't mentioned or relevant, it's just a fun fact. And it's also kind of just fun saying tittle. But what is relevant is how Michael tries to explain the tittle to everyone. It's a Tuesday, and also July, and also it's never. It's the time or moment when nothing never occurs.
This broke me. The dot over the eye. That broke me. I'm done.
Which is such a nothing sentence that it's borderline geniusly written. But to simplify it, the dot above the eye in Jeremy bear me is a representation of the void. It's nothing, it's Tuesdays, it's July. It's not quite the middle of the week or the hottest time of the year, but it's close. Larry Hemsworth. Larry Hemsworth is the fictional fourth Hemsworth brother. One of the brothers playing Thor in Thor Ragnarok, and his other brother also playing Thor in Thor Ragnarok and every other movie and appearance. In the Good Place universe, Larry Hemsworth has generally stayed out of the spotlight that the rest of his brothers live in and works as a pediatric surgeon, mainly fixing baby spines. Larry Hemsworth doesn't actually appear in the series until the Season 3 episode The Snowplow. But strangely, he is actually foreshadowed in the episode prior, when Eleanor is reading Us Weekly. The cover of the magazine reads, Hemsworthless. Meet Larry, the Hemsworth brother they don't want you to know about, with a picture of all four of the Hemsworth brothers. Larry is seen in his photo wearing something that a doctor would traditionally wear. Also, they're being like super mean to Larry in this article, right? Like the brother they're supposedly hiding is a pediatric surgeon, and he's still hot? The color red. Color choice and coordination is a huge part of making sure what you want to portray is portrayed correctly in any media. This is something Breaking Bad took super seriously and did incredibly well, but for a super easy representation, just look at Star Wars. Black for the villains and white for the good guys. But as important as what color a character is wearing can be, the colors that are avoided can be just as impactful. Because you see, in the entirety of Season 1, the color red is avoided as much as possible. This is because the showrunners wanted to avoid any unconscious associations with devils or demons or the bad place. Because any inkling as to where they actually could be could dampen the effect of the huge plot twist at the end of the first season. 9 Circles of Hell. There are a few numbers that seem to pop up again and again in the show. In the first season, a lot of things seem to be grouped in clusters of 9. 9 jumbo shrimp flying through the air. 9 plates outside the yogurt shop. 9 of these things. Are they gears? 9 gears over Eleanor's bed. This is likely a sneaky bit of foreshadowing to the fact that during the first season, despite being told they're in the good place, they're actually in the bad place. The number 9 being a reference to the 9 circles of hell as mentioned in the Inferno portion of Dante's Divine Comedy. In the poem, Dante goes through each of the 9 layers of hell, which each represent a gradual increase in general wickedness and punishment as he descends further and further. The layers being limbo, lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, heresy, violence, fraud, and treachery. And to be honest, it absolutely seems like something the show would do, referencing an Italian poem from the 1300s. Friends. So, no one told you the afterlife was gonna be this way. While the universe of The Good Life does not share a universe with the show Friends, it does share a universe with the show Friends, if that makes sense. Basically, just that Friends is a show that everyone in The Good Place seems to be familiar with. In Season 4, Episode 8, Michael goes on about which of the fictitious members of the Friends group, if any, would deserve to be in the bad place. Ross, of course, deserving to go to the baddest of places. Wait, what? He thinks Chandler's the worst? He's not great either, but come on. Ross is intrinsically the worst. Anyways, the only real objection that Michael seems to have is that Phoebe, obviously, is the one and only Friends character who for sure would not go to the bad place. And I mean, that's fair. Anyways, this short bit is actually paid off a few episodes later when who else but Lisa Kudrow actually shows up. Yes, she's just an actress in the show, but funnily enough, she's someone who actually made it into The Good Place. Like the original, more difficult to get into Good Place. And as it turns out, she's actually the only philosopher who made it into The Good Place, being morally superior to the other philosophers. Just like how Phoebe was morally superior to the rest of the Friends. Especially Ross.
Michael Schur's inspiration. This show brings up so many types of deep philosophical questions, even with the comparatively short run it had to some of Michael Schur's other works. But something I found particularly interesting about it was how it initially came to be. After one of Schur's other projects I mentioned, Parks and Rec, concluded, he was driving around the city of Los Angeles and found himself intensely annoyed with the drivers. And after a certain point, he decided to start sort of ranking these drivers based on a point system. And I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, but this is what ended up being the very first spark for the idea of the show, and this was confirmed by Schur himself.
The bettering place. This was something of a theory before the show actually concluded, but I think there's still at least some weight to it. The general idea was that the characters we're watching aren't or weren't necessarily in the bad place. They were actually in something that we'll refer to as the bettering place. Throughout a lot of the show's run, we find out why many of the characters were originally sent to the bad place. And by the end of the series, a lot of characters have kind of faced down a bunch of their problems and have fundamentally changed themselves to be better people than they were. Eleanor's lack of moral compass and Chidi's indecisiveness being the easiest examples to look at. Eleanor learns to listen to other people and becomes a more caring/compassionate person. And Chidi realizes that his indecisiveness may have been challenging for a lot of people who were in his life. It was really like a purgatory where the group could all learn ways to better themselves. Magic Panda. The Magic Panda is something that's mentioned pretty briefly in Season 2, Episode 2, in a written idea from Jason that simply states, "Catch the Magic Panda, use her powers." And of course, that seems like a pretty short one-off joke. There are no mentions of the Magic Panda for the rest of the series. No mentions, that is. Because we do actually see this supposedly Magic Panda in the show. It's super brief, but it does happen. 3 times. First in Season 2, Episode 9, Leap of Faith, around 12 minutes into the episode. Next in Season 3, Episode 7, The Worst Possible Use of Free Will, around 7 minutes. And finally, in Season 4, Episode 11, Mondays, am I right? Around 20 minutes into the episode. It's a pretty fun Easter egg, almost on par with Community's multi-season Beetlejuice gag and setup. Fibonacci Sequence. In mathematics, the Fibonacci numbers form a sequence, the Fibonacci sequence, in which each number is the sum of the 2 preceding ones. The sequence commonly starts from 0 and 1, although some authors omit the initial terms and start the sequence from 1 and 1 or from 1 and 2. The Fibonacci sequence sounds like just a fun and infinite stretch of numbers, but in reality, it's seen just about everywhere you might look. In design, architecture, and yes, even in nature. Many plants, specifically the number of petals they have, actually follow the Fibonacci sequence. Okay, that's great and all, but what does it have to do with The Good Place? Well, it turns out there are a lot of references to the Fibonacci sequence littered throughout the series. from the very beginning. The very neighborhood the show starts in is neighborhood 1235W, the numbers obviously being some of the first Fibonacci numbers. And from there, they throw the numbers just about anywhere they can, and it makes a bit of sense. Addresses, passing yards in the perfect Madden game, horoscope lucky numbers. These numbers were and are ever present throughout the show. If you keep your eyes open, you'll probably notice the sequence at least once. In a podcast, Michael Schur said that the numbers were intentionally included, as numbers that were supposed to look like they were supposed to mean something, but they really don't. A final form of torture for everyone to deal with. 322. The Fibonacci sequence isn't the only series of numbers that we see hidden throughout the show. Another pretty popular sequence is the number 322. And this sequence doesn't really fit into the Fibonacci sequence or anything like that. Instead, this number might be a reference to the Skull and Bones, or the Order of 322, a secret student society at Yale. The Bones have had an absolute ton of influential members throughout history. Former presidents, professional athletes, famous politicians, the guy who founded the Pittsburgh Penguins, the most important thing in all of US history. All kinds of super important people in American culture. But why include this sequence of numbers in the Fibonacci sequence and all of the others? Well, according to Michael Schur, it's kind of just a reference itself to Lost. The idea of repeating a series of numbers appearing on screen, that is. Well, at least this all led to a pretty satisfying conclusion. Take that, Lost. I wasn't making videos when Lost ended, so I'm taking my shots now.
Why the Good Place Committee is ineffective on purpose. I know that seems a little odd. Why on earth would they do that? Well, the theory goes like this. As we see in Season 4, the Good Place isn't as good as we hoped. It's full of problems. And who exactly stands in the way of the progress? The committee. They seem to be almost intentionally unproductive and make it hard to get into the Good Place. This is because they want to limit the influx of new problems since they can't even take care of their current ones. A lot of people aren't aware that it was actually later announced by Michael Schur that the ineffectiveness of the committee was a display of his personal frustration with progressivism within the Democratic Party, which he basically described as something that is collapsing on itself because they concede to every pressure placed on them, which ends up making the problems even worse.
Michael is actually God. Okay, so there are quite a few different "this character was actually God" theories revolving around the Good Place. Honestly, I think just about every character in the show probably has one, if we're being honest. But this go around we'll be focusing in on Michael, the architect, creator of the original Good Place neighborhood. So we know that all religions were all around 5% correct when it came to the actual afterlife. So this God we're talking about isn't exactly the same as the Judeo-Christian idea of what God is. In this case, Michael doesn't necessarily seem to be omniscient and omnipotent, all-knowing and all-powerful. And somewhere along the way, the algorithm and bureaucracy of the afterlife he created became too bloated and change was essentially impossible. At least from the inside. Instead, Michael went undercover as a demon and decided to expose the inherent flaws of the point system and the problem with unintended consequences. What better way to show the system is broken and needs to be fixed than by taking a couple of people who would certainly have been sent to the bad place and helping these people to better themselves, with these people themselves actually being the ones to point out the flaws with the current system and helping to put a new one into place. But that's just one way this series could be viewed as. The other is the entire show was actually Eleanor's test of the system she created. As we've already discussed, time in the afterlife moves in a very strange way. When drawn out, it appears to take the shape of the words Jeremy bury me when written in cursive. But this has some strange implications if we apply it to the show. You see, some stuff that we see happen later in the series technically takes place before other things because of time kind of looping back around on itself. So if we take that understanding of how time seems to work in the afterlife, it's certainly possible that the entirety of the show is actually Eleanor being tested by the very system she helped create. The very beginning of the series is actually the same Jeremy bury me where she would later create the system. It's actually taking place after that. This Reddit post that explains this theory well puts it another way. Think of the movie Arrival. Also spoilers for Arrival. At the end of the film, we learn that what we thought we were seeing as flashbacks were actually flash forwards. That because of her new understanding of language, her way of thinking and viewing reality had shifted and allowed her to kind of experience time differently. It's something referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or linguistic relativity. But to apply that to the good place, even though we're seeing things in a linear timeline, that doesn't mean everything happening in the show uses the same linear structure. In this universe, time can loop back on itself, and that's something that makes it a bit more complicated. The biggest evidence of this is the little voice that Eleanor hears throughout the entirety of the series. It's pretty easy to write this off as a joke. Yeah, of course Eleanor didn't understand what a conscience was. She was a generally terrible person in life. But then, at the very end of the series, Eleanor walks through the last door, essentially ending her existence in the universe. But as this happens, Eleanor becomes, you guessed it, a little voice. This seems to imply one of two things. Either Eleanor was her own voice all along, or others were going through the last door and becoming little voices by the time Eleanor arrived to the original good/bad place. Either way, it seems to implicate that the entire time this system was already in place and Eleanor was being tested. Chidi is actually a demon. Philosophers aren't typically shown in the best light throughout the show's run. In fact, in the original point system, there's only one philosopher who's made it into the good place, Patty. So would it be too much of a stretch with the show's typical philosopher treatment to find out that Chidi, the show's resident philosopher, was actually a demon the whole time? Though this one really only has one bit of evidence behind it. In season 3, some demons mistake Chidi for a demon named Trent. They say that Trent really hasn't been torturing for the past 800 years. And coincidentally, when dealing with the reboots of the original good/bad place, they end up rebooting it a little over 800 times. Seems like those two facts kind of match up pretty neatly, right? Well, not as neatly as you might think. In a 2017 interview, Michael Schur said that despite the 802 reboot attempts that we know happen, in reality only about 250 to 300 years passed. So that kind of kills the only real evidence that this theory had. But hey, it's still fun to speculate, right? A second demon besides Michael who turns good?
The good place does not exist. Well, not in a literal sense anyway. However, prior to season 4, it was up in the air if the good place even truly existed. I mean, all we knew about it was that nobody had gone there in some 500 years, and that as far as they knew, nobody had gone there at all. The only people they had to verify that fact that it was real were Michael and the judges, and they had no reason to trust them after they found out they were actually in the bad place at the end of season 1. All that aside, what I mean when I say not in a literal sense is sort of the lesson we take away near the show's end. Once we see the good place and verify it's real, we realized that it was never a really good place at all. Everyone had basically been sitting there in limbo waiting for nothing, so the attractive idea of eternity with every possible wish being met fades away. All the great things about a life with a limited time frame were gone. So if you step back and compare the good and the bad, they aren't all that different after all, and they never were. This in turn makes arguably one of the most important divides in the show pointless.
And that's where we'll end this video for now. If you'd like to see a part 2 or something different, comment down below. Follow me on Twitter at 10kbail to stay up to date on everything I'm working on. Support us on our Patreon if you like this content and want to see more like it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.